Thank you very much for inviting me here today. In a little more of a kind of broad overview, I will raise some kind of key points and some key issues that I think are important to think about when we think about sort of humanitarian intervention as a new paradigm for thinking about crisis in the Mediterranean or thinking about mobility in the Mediterranean or the European Union and elsewhere more broadly. We're focused very much here, of course, on the Mediterranean. Of course, Sicily is a key geographic site in the current ongoing migration, in inverted commas, crisis. This is actually the third time I've been in Catania. Previous times I've been here for research because, obviously, as I say, Sicily is a key site. But I think it's important for us to think about the ways in which actually these issues are not just unique to the European context. They're not just unique to the Mediterranean context. Obviously, there are specificities to the Mediterranean context. There are specificities to the European context. But these are also issues that are happening elsewhere. For example, Central America. Currently, there is a large, perhaps ignored humanitarian crisis with people, large numbers of people fleeing Guatemala and El Salvador from a sort of internecine gang warfare. There are, of course, these problems also existing in South Asia with the Rohingya and Southeast Asia, and of course, actually across the African continent as well. So I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. Now, I am a native English speaker. Sometimes I speak quite quickly. I also am sort of increasingly bilingual, and I'm also struggling also sometimes, and I sometimes speak Dutch by accident. So please, if you don't understand something that I say, just raise your hand. Right? My vowel sounds are all over the place currently. People back in the UK are like, huh? What are you saying? I'm like, oh, was that Dutch? Sorry. Okay, so if you don't understand something, please just raise your hand and say, what did you say? Because it actually might be that I'm like, oh yeah, like what did I say? Because it's 20 past 9 in the morning, so. All right, so actually, I was introduced very, very effusively and very nicely, but I would also prepared a little introduction. So I have been working on what I have come to call humanitarian border work for the last 5 years or so. And I actually started working on this actually accidentally. Interesting. The best things come about, I think, accidentally, right? I think there's always talk in research about the ways in which if you have a too well-defined research plan and a clear pathway, you miss all of the other things. And people often talk about this in relation to the hard sciences, and actually some of the best scientific discoveries have actually been found effectively by accident, right? People have been doing one thing and actually something else has occurred. Well, actually, this is really how I came to work on humanitarian practices and their intersection with border control. I was on fieldwork in Greece. I, at the previous time, had a research interest in border walls and fences, and I'd gone to Evros in Greece to look at the new fence that the Greeks were building on their very short 10.5 kilometer land border, literally land border, it's not a river, it's just a field, with Turkey, because I was interested in the ways in which border fences, border walls, were a kind of materialization of this sort of older form of securitization that we have studied in international relations around sort of the managing of human mobility. And while I was there, I was like, actually, this fence is really a bit boring. It's not that interesting. And I was able to shadow for a week or so the Greek police and their other European Union counterparts, because it was a joint operation with the European Union. It was a Frontex joint operation, which meant that they have to be open to and accountable to European Union researchers. So I asked Frontex if I could go and shadow them, and they let me follow them around effectively for a week. And while I was following them around, and talking to them off the record, that usual trick of field work. Always try and find the people, especially if they're security professionals or people we call studying up. They're not the sort of professionals and access is hard to gain. Always try and find where they drink in the evening and what bars they go to and sort of subtly just sit there. Can I ask you a question? So in these informal discussions, as well as the sort of more formal participant observation that I was doing, what actually really came to be very clear was that the majority of their border policing practices were involved not just with stopping people, not just with managing mobility at the border in terms of preventing access, preventing irregular migration across the border from Turkey, but actually the majority of it was focused on the saving of people's lives. Since the fence had been built, this was a very safe, before the fence, they were just fields, it was a very safe way for people to move from Turkey into Greece. Of course, they can't use the regular border crossing points for reasons that I'm sure you know, but we'll get to a little bit later. So after they'd built the fence, people were, if they wanted to enter the European Union, were forced to try and cross through the river. Now, the river is very, very fast flowing. It's actually very, very cold. And it was actually a serious site of danger for people trying to enter the European Union. And so the border police, the Greek border police and their European Union counterparts, many of whom interestingly were Dutch. So it's very strange looking at all these Dutch border control jeeps that we don't have in the Netherlands anymore since Schengen. They're all really old. They're all now in Greece. It was very odd, kind of like talking to people in Dutch in Greece. The majority of their operations, the majority of their time, the majority of their surveillance equipment, expertise, night vision goggles, tracking systems were actually spent locating people in order to actually rescue them. Causing tensions then, of course, between the need to control the border against movement, but then also the need to save lives. So kind of dual policing functions. And so this is where I started accidentally. I was like, okay, well, this is actually very interesting. And at that time, there were a few scholars who had started talking about the ways in which the European Union was increasingly, especially through sort of the discourse of Frontex, employing humanitarian language, humanitarian rhetoric, a language around rights, to sort of guard against the accusation that was increasingly coming from civil society, European civil society, and some sections of the European Parliament, that Frontex kills, in inverted commas, right? This was a very common accusation, a very common refrain in the sort of late 2010s and the early part of this decade. And I said, okay, I sort of read this work, and I was like, okay. I always like to go beyond just discourse. I always like to think beyond what is said in policy documents and think about how this works in practice. And what I found very interesting was that this was not on the ground in the everyday work of the Greek police, who are charged not only with policing the border of Greece, but also policing the border of the European Union on behalf of all of the 28, it's 27 now, 28, 27, however many we want to say, member states, and predominantly the Schengen member states. Not only are they tasked with doing this, but in their everyday life, in their everyday working lives, they are also policemen whose job is to protect life. This is what the police also do, right? I come from a tradition with a lot of people who always like to sort of use the phrase, you see it graffitied everywhere. Italy is no exception. ACAB, all cops are bastards. That's not. Sometimes they are not so nice, right? But they have the monopoly on the use of violence on behalf of our sovereign states. But they are also tasked with the saving of life. And so there was this tension that played out very, very viscerally for these people. They are local people. They are local to the region. They have grown up in the area of Evros. Many of them come from families and histories of generations of police officers. And they take their responsibility to protect the population, protect the public very, very seriously. But that notion of protection has a dual meaning. It means, yes, protecting the population, Greece, right, the population within, but it also means protecting life, right, citizens and, importantly, non-citizens, especially in the moment of emergency. So I would discuss with them and I would say, okay, you rescue these people from the river, well, then what do you do with them? They're like, oh, well, that's not our concern, they shouldn't be here, they're illegal, we take them to the detention center and then they get pushed back. I was like, okay, so there was this tension. But in the moment of emergency, the most important thing, and this was reiterated to me again and again, was the saving of human life. That was the central thing. And this wasn't just a rhetoric, because I saw it in their practice. I spent hours watching video footage of these river rescues. I saw river rescues taking place, and it was a responsibility that they took very seriously. Right? They were deeply unhappy and deeply upset and felt that they had actually failed if migrants, refugees, had actually died while they were patrolling the border. They felt that they had failed in their duties. So this is what started me on my journey of exploring this intersection between a kind of humanitarian logic of the saving of life and its tension, contradiction with a more kind of fixed, sovereign, securitization focus idea of managing, controlling the border. And sort of to think about how that works, both theoretically, conceptually, but also in practice. And I've come to call this humanitarian border work because in border studies we have this idea that the border is continuously produced, right? It's not just something that is, it doesn't just exist out there separate from the social, political, economic relations of the states, of societies, but it is constantly produced and reproduced through the work of everyday work, be it by the border police, be it by customs officials, or actually be it by people like you or me. Right? We actually also can think about the ways in which we are involved in reproducing particular types of borders. And this is true in the case of humanitarian work. Humanitarian work also works to produce borders in particular ways. These are often different to the types of borders that are produced, or there's a different logic to them than the types of borders that are produced through border policing, through a simple kind of control logic, but there are similarities and there are overlaps. And of course, with the growth in the migration crisis, refugee crisis, from 2012 up until the present day, we have seen an increase in the numbers, the types, and the locations, the sites of humanitarian intervention that is responding to the risks that people face when they try and make the journeys to safety, to seek life in Europe. And we've seen a sort of multiplication of the numbers of actors. So it's no longer simply state actors who are involved in this kind of humanitarian, biopolitical work of saving lives, but it's increasingly also international humanitarian agencies and much sort of smaller volunteer groups, individuals, people. And we can also think about actually how there's a long history of particular types of humanitarian acts, especially at sea. For example, Italian fishermen have a long history of rescuing people out in the Straits of Sicily, commercial vessels also. And so since then, I've undertaken a lot of fieldwork, both in Italy, here in Sicily, and in Greece, but also at various humanitarian HQs, as well as the EU institutions in Brussels, across Europe, and I'm now an academic associate member of MSF Holland, and I do a lot of work with the operational centre there in Amsterdam. And MSF was the operational centre in Amsterdam was the first MSF operational center is a very complicated structure, MSF, was the first operational center to engage in humanitarian search and rescue efforts alongside and in conjunction with MOASH, starting in 2015. What I want to talk to you about today is I want us to recap where are we right now concerning humanitarian intervention at Europe's borders. It's a very dynamic issue. It's fluctuating and changing all the time. I have to take a step back from it sometimes. I focus on teaching or boring academic admin. I come back to it and I'm like, oh, you know what, actually, there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of things happening all the time, but actually perhaps not so much is really changing. Then I want us to think actually about, well, what is humanitarianism? Because a lot of the time we jump straight into talking about, okay, humanitarian intervention, humanitarian rescue, search and rescue, all of these kinds of things. But we don't actually stop and reflect and think about what humanitarianism actually is. We tend to think it's a given. We're like, oh yeah, that's what humanitarianism is. But actually, when you start studying it in more detail, you start studying the genealogy of it, where the ideas come from, where the kind of particular practices, the particular logics come from, actually the field is much richer and more diverse than we perhaps at first glance would assume. Then I want to sort of think historically a little bit, have a little bit of a genealogy of humanitarian intervention at Europe's borders. I want to sort of take us out of this particular crisis moment and to think about the way that perhaps this is not really new. There are certain things about it which are new, but actually that these are particular practices, particular acts, particular ways of thinking about the world, thinking about human beings, the rights of human beings, that have been going on for longer than we perhaps realize. And I think it's helpful for us to sort of reflect on that. And I think it's also very interesting being here in Italy, that actually Italy has been one of the countries with a much longer genealogy specifically of humanitarian rescue at sea, partly because, of course, of its geography. Then I want to think a little bit about the different actors that we see engaged in humanitarian intervention, from the European Union level to the member states to the diverse non-governmental, non-state actors, and to try and make sense of the field in terms of the actors, and then think about the controversies and the conflicts that actually emerge from humanitarian intervention, from these particular actors. To think about the ways that humanitarianism is used differently by different actors, how humanitarianism can come to mean different things to different people, and that intervention can have different effects. And therefore to sort of think about the politics of this, because we tend to, one of the things that humanitarianism tends to say is that it's apolitical. This is just not true. They'll say it's apolitical, and then you'll speak to humanitarians, and they're like, of course it's not political, everything we do is political, right? The apoliticization of humanitarianism is really a strategy that enables intervention up to a certain point. So let's sort of think about the politics, the role of power, the power relations, the hierarchies that are produced, the forms of contestation between sovereign actors, sovereign state actors, sort of acting on behalf of their member states, the populations of their member states, or the wider European Union, and humanitarian actors who are driven by a commitment to a kind of universal humanity. Let's think a little bit about the tensions and the different ways of seeing the world that produces, right? The different ways of sort of framing and thinking about how we've constructed our world and the role of people within it. So where are we today? This map is from February of this year, February 2017, taken from a European Commission report that was sort of looking into or sort of summarizing the state of search and rescue in the Mediterranean in the present time, in the winter of 2017, but also how it's changed over time. So we can see it maps effectively, it sort of gives us a small genealogy of the development and the growth and the dispersal, the geographic dislocation or dispersal of search and rescue efforts. So you can see the blue line, the light blue line is the territorial waters of Tunisia and Libya. So we can see they're quite close into the coastline. The orange lines are the search and rescue lines. So this would be the Libyan search and rescue area. The one above it is the Italian search and rescue area. This is who is responsible, effectively, for search and rescue efforts in these parts of international waters. And then the dark blue line are the old, original Triton operational areas, so joint operation, Triton operational areas. And you can see how, over time, and this is also partly, it's not just to do with the expansion of the number of search and rescue vessels in the Mediterranean, but it's also to do with the changing materiality of it, so the ways in which the boats are becoming much less sturdy, for want of a, we're seeing many more, for example, rubber dinghies being sent out, and so the need to rescue people closer to the Libyan coastline is becoming ever greater, and also to do with the changing nature of smuggling operations in Libya over time. So we can see how over time the number of rescues has got further and further and further south, to the point now where rescues are actually taking place well into Libyan territorial waters, almost right up to the coastline. Okay, so this has changed over time. This is where we are now, effectively, and how we've got there, and you can sort of see it mapped over time. And there's many reasons as to why this has changed. But in that sense, rescue now seems to be routinized. We've come to kind of take it as something that's normal, right? Something that's sort of everyday. It's been going on for the last, well, with Mare Nostrum and then Triton, it's been going on for 5 years. Then you have the increase or the interventions of humanitarian organizations engaging in search and rescue. These are now going on into the 3rd year. MOAS started in 2014. This is the 3rd year of non-state humanitarian actors engaging in search and rescue. This is now becoming routine. Right, I checked these figures yesterday. It's at nearly 9,000, not quite. I don't know, that was last night. Maybe a few more people have been rescued this morning. But as of last night, 9,000 people have been rescued in 2017 alone. This is a routine item. So we talk about an emergency, we talk about a crisis, but this seems to be routine now. Right? This is an awful lot of people. If 9,000 people had been rescued from regular transportation in 2017, so 9,000 people, say, rescued from airplanes, we'd be seeing like a grounding of all airplanes, like no one would be allowed to fly. If 9,000 people were being rescued from the ferry between Pozzallo and Malta since 2017, I don't think that ferry would be, it's a catamaran, I don't think it would be running anymore, right? This is serious. Why is it that we can say, oh, 9,000 people, yeah, whatever. It's a crisis, it's a routinized emergency. There are reasons for this. Many of them around the ways in which irregular migration has been illegalized or made irregular for the majority of people through specific European border policies and practices, making it very difficult for the majority of the world's population to travel across borders safely. Right. Partly to do with the ways in which actually the lack of what humanitarians call safe passage fuels the smuggling industry, right? I remember sitting, off the record, I sit with so many policemen, be it in Greece or in Italy or at Frontex in Warsaw or in the Netherlands, and you say to them, you know, like, what do you think about the smugglers? They're like, well, you know, the smugglers are, of course, they're the bad guys, but like, of course, like, if you make something illegal, you totally open up an entire field for them you give them an entire new business model. It's just the same as that you ban alcohol, you're gonna have people, organized criminals, engaging in the smuggling and the making of alcohol. You ban cigarettes, you're gonna have people smuggling cigarettes. You ban the mobility of people, you will have people seeing that as an opportunity to make money and engaging in the smuggling of people. So when you push these policemen, you know, okay, well, what is the solution? And they're like, well, I'm not a politician, I just enforce the rules, but you know, off the record, of course, it's all completely preventable and very silly, and we could just not have any of these problems if we just let people cross the border legally like you. And then we could actually check them because we can see who they are and where they come from, and ask them to present their identity documents. But this has become routine. Emergency crisis, the rescuing of people, especially in the central Mediterranean, has become routinized. And we're not stopping and saying, why is this? So not only have 9,000 people been rescued in 2017 alone, but since 2014, the IOM's Missing Migrants project puts the number of people dead at over 14,000 since 2014. And these are just the people we know about, importantly. These are just the deaths that have been counted. The number is probably much higher. Right? You can only record a death if there's a body, and you can, right? We don't know how many boats sank somewhere here that no one ever found, or bodies that washed up on beaches that coroners didn't list or contact central authorities about as saying coming from a shipwreck. This is a lot of people. And this is just at the Mediterranean border. Technically now, the Mediterranean border is classed as the most deadly border in the world. I remember being at a conference and that was announced, and some people were like, yes! And I was like, it's not a competition. And they're like, yeah, more funding for us. And then like the Americans who work on the US-Mexico border were like, oh no, we're not gonna get so much funding anymore. Less people are dying. And it's just like, this is some macabre kind of neoliberal security logic to the funding of research, but actually, sadly, it is kind of true. But 14,000 people are known to have died since 2014, and that's only since 2014 when people really started counting. This isn't accounting for the people who were coming in 2011, for example, after the Arab Spring, up until 2014, or the people who were coming in the 1990s and in the 2000s. Right? We literally do not know how many people. And so as we know where we are today, rescues are becoming more dispersed. They are happening and occurring increasingly closer and closer to Libya, in Libyan territorial waters, partly because Libya just does not have the capacity to carry out search and rescues itself. We don't need to get into a discussion. I'm not an expert on the politics of what is going on right now in Libya. I don't know how many governments they have, 5 or something. The EU seems to think that they can talk with people in Libya and carry out serious partnership agreements and work with them. I'm like, who are you talking to? Which Libyans? Libya, I don't like the language of failed states, because I don't think that's actually particularly helpful. But Libya is a crisis, very much so, is a crisis. But as we know, rescues are increasingly being carried out by non-state actors. This is a growing field, even as the European Union is attempting to regulate it more and more. The Italian state and other states are increasingly sort of seeing humanitarian search and rescue efforts by non-state actors as being colluding with smugglers, offering a ferry service, etc., etc. Attempts at criminalization are occurring, but that's not stopping an expansion in the field. it seems like every other month there's a new actor emerging. So it started with simply the Migrant Offshore Aid Station, then MSF became involved, then we had Sea-Watch, then we had, I'm losing track, then we had the Bootverluxeling and the Dutch, then we had Save the Children, then we had SOS Méditerranée, which is part of Médecins du Monde, then we had Proactiva. I'm just like, there's so many. I'm sure I've missed people out now. There are others. There are so many actors now currently in the Mediterranean, alongside, on top of regular Coast Guard, regular military, regular commercial vessels, etc., etc. And within this field, within this kind of emerging normalcy, or we could say routinized crisis, routinized emergency, the EU and its member states have, and they continue to have, ambivalent and contradictory attitudes to search and rescue operations. I mean, we can't say that Italy says one thing, that the Netherlands, Germany says something else, because who gets to speak on behalf of the member states, right? So you may have politicians saying one thing, but then the people who actually have to carry it out on the ground or at sea will think something else. So the Italian government may say one thing about search and rescue, but the Coast Guard have a different idea. They're the ones that are out there every day, tasked with actually the saving of lives at sea, right? So they have a different attitude to humanitarianism, to humanitarian search and rescue, and to the idea of sort of helping migrants, reducing risk more generally, right? There is not a consensus on this. There are attempts to build a consensus, and the EU loves to produce documentation in which it says, this is what we believe. Right? I swear the EU produces so much paperwork. Like, I have a friend who used to work for the archival service. They produce so many reports and statements. It's like they're willing themselves into existence by writing stuff down. It's like, if we write it down, we exist as a supranational political body that people have to take seriously. It's like, wow. And they make it all available to citizens so that we can go, wow, the EU. And then you kind of look through it, there are like new action plans. There's like a new action plan every week. I'm like, it just says the same thing as 4 years ago, or they've added one new trendy, sexy word, like resilience this year, or development, or whatever. Like like, my God. The new thing is like, helping people in their countries of origin. It's like, okay, that's the new one. Okay, good. We're back there. That was like a decade ago. This is like not new. But anyway. So there really is not a consensus, especially as actually on the ground when it comes to search and rescue, when it comes to border control, when it comes to the granting of asylum, when it comes to citizenship rules and regulations. It's the member states that determine this, because that's sovereignty. And if it was the EU that didn't determine this, that did determine this, well then we could say that the EU was sovereign. But border control, border management, these things still remain the sovereign responsibility of member states. And actually, often when you get into debates with Eurosceptics, there's a lot of them in my country of origin. You get into debates with Eurosceptics, and they use the migration crisis as a reason to kind of, the EU is bad. You say, yeah, but like you complain about what's going on in Calais, or you complain about too many people on Lampedusa, but what would help? Why are there so many people at Calais? Well, there are lots of people at Calais because they want to come to Britain because they think it's got an easier asylum system. It really doesn't, actually. Like, Britain has like the harshest asylum system of like pretty much any kind. But they want to come to Britain because of our asylum system. You know what would help that? They're doing asylum shopping. You know what would help that? A common asylum policy. They're like, oh, but that's more Europe. Yes. They're like, oh, yeah. So there's a tension here. This whole field is highly political. But the problem, and I think when we focus, and I could spend all day discussing slightly flippantly this politics at a European level, but when we focus on that, actually what we're missing is that right now there are, well, just yesterday, 900 people were rescued in the Straits of Sicily. These are 900 lives. These are people with names, they're people with families, they're people with histories, they're people with dreams and aspirations, just like us. And they're wanting, for whatever reason, to exercise their human right to mobility. It is a fundamental human right. They are exercising that right for a life. And if you read the reports right now about what is going on in Libya, you can fundamentally understand why people do not want to stay there. We are talking about people being traded in slave markets, women being held in detention centers which have effectively become brothels. We are talking about people who are being tortured, right, on Skype in front of their families back home, and demands being paid out for more money to be sent, etc., etc. When you read the reports of the types of injuries that are uncovered when people are rescued, it is really, really shocking. Right? So these are people, and they have complex reasons, complex migratory histories. They may have left their country originally to seek a better life, to seek their fortune elsewhere. Right? I'm an economic migrant. I moved to the Netherlands for a job, right? For a future, for a better life than I had in the United Kingdom. These might be people who have started on their journey for whatever reason. Their migratory journey may change, right? Often on their journeys, sometimes these journeys are very long, and on these journeys they encounter different risks, new risks, problems that actually mean that they are in need of some form of humanitarian protection. And that's certainly, definitely the case in Libya today. So we have to think about the complexities of these people and the journeys they make and the different forms of risk that are faced by people. And then, of course, there are issues that present which are not immediately obvious, right? So they're not that, oh, someone is rescued and they have bullet wounds in their legs because they've been shot at by guards in a detention center. There is serious psychosocial trauma. Pretty much everybody that is rescued in the Mediterranean will have some form of psychosocial trauma that needs to be addressed, and they have a right to have it treated in some way. So that's where we are today, from the kind of, the kind of discussions at the council meetings, right down to the very specific individual human lives of the people that are being rescued right now and brought to various ports, sometimes to Catania, here in Sicily. But what is humanitarianism? The UNHCR. People always think of, refugees, UNHCR. We can have a discussion about the UNHCR afterwards. We'll discuss it a little more, perhaps, in the break. And the very contradictory role or role of tension that the UNHCR plays between trying to advocate and manage and provide the necessary conditions for life for refugees, and the way it actually acts as something like a sort of security actor for states to protect them from the problems of mobile populations. We can discuss the kind of slightly difficult position that the UNHCR is in historically. But what is humanitarianism, right? We tend to think about it as a kind of 20th century phenomena presented to us in popular discourse, in popular culture, as being practiced by non-state international groups, right? We've all watched if you haven't watched them, well, I'm not going to say lucky you, but perhaps you should watch them because they're really hilarious for completely the wrong reasons. So we may have all watched those movies with like Angelina Jolie, where she's like, have you seen this one? What is it called? Like something Crossing Borders or something? Where she goes, it's like basically she's going to Ethiopia and she ends up working for the UNHCR. It's hilarious. for all the wrong reasons, because it presents this like really, really romanticized, exciting view of humanitarianism. Then we have the wonderful one that I think that came out last year with Sean Penn and Charlize Theron. Interestingly, their relationship broke up after that film came out. That's terrible. Again, presenting this kind of idea of white people going to places where brown people are to save them. Right? Goodly, kind Europeans with their views about universal humanity sort of exercise their ability to bring life to people who are not able to care for themselves. We tend to have this view, this sort of romanticized view of this is what humanitarianism is. And we can think about particular crises that it comes about from. So the sort of the narrative, the history of it is, the Battle of Solferino, right? This is when the ICRC comes into being because Henry Dunant saw all these poor people on the battlefield and thought this is terrible and people should not be, they have whatever country they fight for, they have the right to life. So this extends up from the late 19th century into the 20th century. Then we have the crises of the First World War, the Second World War, we have the growth of humanitarian law, and then we have other crises, so Biafra, the famine in Biafra, the Ethiopian famine, a sort of series of these events which sort of cement the kind of large-scale non-governmental organizations in the humanitarian field. Of course, the history of it is much more complicated. That's one history of it. That's a kind of romantic, mythical history of it. It's a bit like the kind of the myth of IR, right? That international relations as a discipline came into being in Aberystwyth after the First World War because, Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points was ignored at the Treaty of Versailles, and this is not true, right? Because states were doing international relations before, 1919. What was the First World War if it wasn't international relations? Anyway, this is the romantic view of humanitarianism. But actually, if we look at it and we look at the genealogy more historically, it's actually something, the idea that you need to protect human life, that the sovereign, and that the sovereign is not always intramuros, right? It's not always within the walls. For those of you who's read Foucault here, who's read Security, Territory, and Population, you have to read it. He has this whole wonderful kind of discussion around the ways in which modernity and the modern state is effectively a change in the attitude of how we think about what the role of the sovereign is. And historically, the role of the sovereign was that the king lived within his walls, and he was sovereign over everything in his territory, be it the cows, the people, and there was no kind of distinction between the cows, the trees, the people. They were like his property, his, and it was pretty much always a he. His property. There were a few occasions when it wasn't a he, but then they kind of had to act like a he. So, Elizabeth I. So, always a he. And we have this idea that that's intramuros, within the walls, within the country, within the state. Then the sovereign, modernity, the growth of modernity, Hobbes's Leviathan. Have you seen that really famous picture of Hobbes' Leviathan, where he's sitting, the king, he's a man, with a crown, and he has a trident, and he's kind of sitting over his territory, and he's made up of lots of little people. It's a really clever picture, right? This is to suggest that the role of the sovereign is to work for, to protect the population. This is a change in the role of the sovereign. It's no longer simply about that the role of the sovereign is to protect what is within the walls, be it cows, canals, trees, and some people, but that the role of the sovereign is for the protection and the security of the population. Then there is another way of thinking about the protection of the population, and this is in tension with this idea of the sovereign, Leviathan. And it's a very old history of security, right? And Foucault traces it very well. Others have done it, but Foucault talks about it very nicely. And that is the role of what's called pastoral power, pastoral protection, the shepherd, right? So it's very Judeo-Christian, right? Jesus is like the ultimate shepherd, right? He wanders around, whenever he goes within the city, within the walls, bad stuff happens to him, like he dies. But he wanders around protecting his flock, right? I mean, that's literally how it's talked about, right? Moses is the same, my people, you know, we move around. This idea that actually, and these are not defined simply, especially within the kind of Christian canon, this is not defined by a basis of nationality, countries, or citizenship, right? Everybody can be part of the flock of Christianity. Everybody can be part of the ummah, right? If you follow Muslim tradition. This is a very different idea about protection. And it's not spatially contained. And it's really these kinds of logics which we can actually sort of trace a history of humanitarianism into, or from. And importantly, the modern state has tried to balance these two different approaches to protection. There's a recognition that within the modern state, well, actually not even the modern state, historically, things have moved about. Things have to move about. Things have to circulate. If things don't circulate, actually people die. Animals have to move around. Water moves around. Food moves about, right? If you lock yourselves in a walled city for like 2 years, eventually you'll starve to death because you don't have any food. That's how medieval sieges worked. That's how everybody died at Masada. They thought, we'll be safe on the top of this mountain. The Romans can't get us. And the Romans were like, yeah, you stay there, it's fine, but you're going to die eventually because, you know, there'll be no food and water, so that's cool. Right. Stuff has to move. But that stuff can sometimes be or cause insecurity. That stuff itself can need protecting. And so the modern state has evolved ways to rationally and efficiently protect stuff that moves, stuff that is in crisis, right? The modern state needs to contain crises, to effectively, rationally manage crises in order to protect itself. And so these are also logics that we see within humanitarianism. Because humanitarianism exists and responds, or is thought to exist and respond, to crisis situations, to crises of protection. Right. So it is a sort of something of a myth that only international organizations have humanitarian logics. They don't. States also have humanitarian logics. The managing, the effective management of disaster is something that the modern state does. And the management of that disaster is done for two reasons: for the preservation of human life, yes, but also for the preservation and the security of the state. So you often see this in response to, especially national disasters and emergencies. There is a need for a state to respond and to respond quickly, because if you do not respond to human need, there is a breakdown in law and order. Right? Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans is a really good example of this. The state was absent, people were hungry, people were homeless, people had no water. So what did they do? They went and got some from the supermarket. We call it looting, but the state wasn't there, and so law and order breaks down very, very quickly. These are also humanitarian logics to protection. The sort of genealogy of political theory, political thought, but also practice is actually highly Eurocentric, right? It's not universal, right? There are ways in which we can trace similar logics within other traditions. So, for example, the Southern African tradition of Ubuntu is very similar in its kind of approach to a kind of humanity that we sort of see within the sort of the European framework. There are also similar traditions within, for example, Indian political theory, Indian political thought, many of which were taken up by those who are very involved in the independence struggle in India. So people like Rabindranath Tagore, very famous kind of universalist who sort of gave a kind of Indian twist. Well, I wouldn't say Indian, actually, it was more of a Bengali twist to some of the similar ideas that sort of were around in the European political tradition. So I think we have to be very clear. Yes, there are attempts, international organizations attempt to suggest that there is a universal idea. I mean, the United Nations would be an example of an attempt to suggest that there is a universal or agreed upon attitude towards some kind of protection, right to life, and the response to refugees. But even within the response to refugees, there are not every state is a signatory to the UN conventions, be it the 51 Convention or the 63 Amendment, right? But again, there are differences between humanitarianism, which deals very, very broadly with the right to life, that human beings all have the right to live and to life and to protection and care and dignity, and then human rights, which are codified. They are codified at an international level, and then they are codified at different various country and supranational levels, right? So the European Union has a charter on fundamental rights, right, that forms the basis of our rights as European Union citizens, and the rights of anybody who happens to be within the territory of the European Union. Importantly, human rights, and this is and this is why the humanitarian field is so interesting, is that there is overlap between them. Right? Over the last 20 to 30 years, humanitarians have engaged much more with practices of human rights, with human rights practitioners, with debates around human rights, at the same time recognizing that in certain instances, discussions around human rights are seen as interventionist, human rights are seen as a way of certain countries attempting to change attitudes, policies, and practices within states. So humanitarians have had a kind of complex relationship to human rights and to human rights practice, because it can actually prevent them from doing their work. So the best example of this would be humanitarian practitioners in Myanmar today. Right? They will not talk about human rights. They will not talk about human rights abuses. They will not talk about the rights of the Rohingya as a religious minority, the rights of the Rohingya to have some form of recognition of their citizenship, recognizing that those are huge problems, but if they talked about them and advocated for them, they would not be allowed in the country. Right? So this is what I mean by humanitarians have a kind of complex relationship to human rights. It's not that they ignore them, it's not that they don't think that they're important, but they are different. Right? Human rights are thought of as being inherently political. Right? It's a right. I have a right. Right? It's something you can make a claim about. Right? It's kind of social movement, Charles Tilly 101. I make my claim. Right? They are seen as being inherently political. They are seen as positive. And there are also problems with human rights too, and human rights discourse, and what we consider to be a right. They are seen as inherently political. Humanitarianism is seen as not political, right? It's seen as apolitical. It's seen as impartial. It's seen as neutral. It simply upholds the thing that we all have in common, and that is that we are human beings. And beyond that, and as human beings, we have a right to life. So it is a right, but it's a very, very limited right. Of course, in practice, humanitarians engage in different ways, right? They practice this right to life in different ways. They focus on different things. They focus on access to medical care, or they practice this commitment to humanity and the upholding of human dignity by the practicing of medicine, or they do it through the provision of the very basic things you need to survive, so water, sanitation, housing, and food. Right? Yes, we can say these are rights, but they're not talked about in that way. But importantly, and this is where humanitarianism differs from human rights is, we could say, a kind of a project, right? It has a starting point and supposedly an end point, or it looks into the future. It's something to achieve. It's something that's ongoing, right? It's a part of a legal framework. Humanitarianism is not that, right? Humanitarianism is thought to respond to emergency or crisis. That's different. That's not about the rule of law. That's not about your rights as a citizen, right? All these kind of things that we kind of often, if you come from a European context, fundamentally take for granted. Like, we just don't think about it. We're like, yeah, I have the right to this and that. We don't think about it until they're threatened. When they become threatened, then we start to actually think about them a little more seriously. So, human rights is a project. It's a legal framework. It's something that you have, right, and you can ask for. Humanitarianism responds to emergency. Now, of course, emergency isn't pre-given. Emergency doesn't just exist out there, like separate from socio-political relations and framings. Right? An emergency, a crisis, has to be named as such. Right? It doesn't just come into being. There are things that we think of as a crisis. So we talk now about the migration crisis, the refugee crisis, the Mediterranean crisis. Right? But we tend to think that this crisis has only been going on since maybe, well, apparently, we had the 2011 crisis, then we had like a crisis in 2015, but actually kind of nothing had really changed between those times. I don't know if we're still in the crisis. At least it's not thought that you're still in the crisis in Northern Europe. It's kind of like the crisis is over, people have stopped coming, now it's about integration, whereas the crisis is still going on if you live in Southern Europe, right? Things have to be labeled a crisis. They have to be called a crisis. A crisis is not always self-evident because we didn't label the arrivals of peoples, the drownings of peoples that have been going on in the Mediterranean actually for 20 plus years as a crisis. Right? We don't necessarily, there are many things that we don't call a crisis. Right? I was reading something yesterday about somebody being like, how is nobody talking about what is going on in Yemen? Right? Yemen is a crisis. It's a forgotten crisis, or it's an ignored crisis. It's like people are actively ignoring what is going on in Yemen. Right? So a crisis is constructed, and it's often constructed for particular reasons. Right, because crisis is highly productive. When you label something an emergency or a crisis, you demand a response. So if you don't want to respond to something, you don't label it a crisis. Right? If you're a politician, you'd be really stupid to be like, oh my God, this is a crisis. And everyone goes, oh no, we must do something. It's like Susan Lovelace from The Simpsons. Would somebody think of the children, right? You don't label something a crisis and then go, yeah, and walk off. Because then you'd be like, what are you doing? It's a crisis. Why aren't you doing anything? You have to help. Right? So you just kind of go, oh, it's not happening. If I don't know it's going on, and I don't say it's serious, I don't have to do it. I don't know, I do this. There are certain things that I kind of ignore. I just pretend they're not there and hope they go away. And it's like, if I just ignore it for like 3 months, then the time will have elapsed. Oh, yeah, oh, sorry. Right? But if I'm like, shit, crisis, better fix it now. And importantly, crisis and emergency do other things, right? They actually, what it does when you label something a crisis, when you label something an emergency, you remove it from the political realm of deliberation. You remove it from a kind of social democratic politics. Because it's an emergency, it requires a response now. And some things are emergencies, right? Some things really are, right? Someone is drowning right there in front of you. You're not going to sit around and go, well, what should we do? Let's discuss the structural and socio-political causes of why this person ended up on this boat and why they are drowning. No, you're going to save the person. Because if you didn't, you're just not a very nice person. But to constantly frame things as a crisis, you remove it from the social democratic discussion, and we don't ever have a discussion about why something is happening. And we keep doing this at the European Union level. We don't have a really proper discussion about why 9,000 people have been rescued this year in the Straits of Sicily. Not a proper discussion. We don't have a discussion about why are they even on these boats in the first place, right? Because, I traveled here. I didn't come in a little boat. I came on a plane. You know, I've travelled, I've got the ferry multiple times. I mean, Pozzallo and Malta. It's lovely, really quick. It only takes like 50 minutes. It's great. You have a little day trip in Malta and go have some lunch and nice fish lunch and go home. Right? Why is it that I'm kind of like, oh, just, you know, get the ferry, it's all cool. Right? I've taken the ferry from Spain to Morocco, no problem. Taken the ferry from Turkey to Greece, Greece to Turkey, and back again. Right? From Mytilene to Chesme. It costs 20 euros. It takes 45 minutes. I spent a whole month watching people arrive in Lesbos, crossed 10 to 12 kilometers of sea in tiny little dinghies, which they'd paid 1,000 plus, between 1,000 and 2,000 euros a ticket for. But I could just get the ferry for 20 euros. We don't have that discussion about why is it that some people have the privilege to move and to use regular and safe forms of transportation, and other people don't have the right to move. And we don't want to have that discussion, because we have built the European Union and we've built Schengen and we've built our freedoms and our freedom of movement within on the back of denying and excluding the rights of other people who are not you, who didn't have the luxury to be born by accident. I didn't ask to be born in the United Kingdom. Actually, right now I'd rather not have been, but that's Brexit, right? Didn't have the luxury to be born where I was and happen to be a European Union citizen. We don't have that discussion. And we won't have that discussion if we keep labeling things a crisis. And actually, interestingly, what humanitarians say, what humanitarian practitioners say, and this is specifically something that MSF stresses continuously, and they made it very famous in their Nobel Prize speech when they won the Nobel Prize in 1999. They literally started their speech after thanking the committee by saying, there is no such thing as a crisis. There is only political failure. And this is actually true to a large extent, even in the case of natural disasters. There is not, yes, there is a natural disaster and bad things can happen, but those bad things tend to happen only because human beings are not prepared. Right? So I've spent some time in Japan, and I was living on a high floor of a building. I woke up in the morning, I looked at the news, and apparently there was an earthquake. I had no idea. It was like 6.5 on the Richter scale. Like, oh, okay. And everyone's carrying on as normal. Nobody cares, right? It's like totally normal, right? But if I was living somewhere else, 6.5 on a Richter scale, actually, when there was an earthquake in Lesbos last week, 2 weeks ago, that caused a whole village to collapse and people to die, because people were not prepared. Political failures, right? Those of you who've been following what's been going on in the United Kingdom with the tower, the Grenfell Tower, that caught fire, right? That, yes, it's terrible, it's a crisis, but it's not. It's a failure of politics. It's a failure of politicians to adequately insist on decent quality housing for people. It's a failure of politics. It's a failure to insist that non-flammable cladding is added to tower blocks. So yes, a fire can happen, but actually we are humans. We are really, really smart. We put people on the moon. We've sent stuff on to land on distant moons and asteroids and stuff. We've sent little rovers to Mars. Like, we're really smart. We can perfectly well contain, and we should be perfect. I'm renovating my flat right now, and the amount of paperwork and inspections that I have had just to make sure my flat is fireproof, and that if something happens with my new kitchen, it doesn't make next door's flat catch fire, is immense. Political decisions have gone in to sort of prevent. Yes, it would be very sad for me, my kitchen would burn down, but actually it would not be a crisis. Well, maybe for me, right? But if people were to die, it would actually really be a failure. and a failure of the state to insist on the protection of the people that live within it. Obviously, we often think about humanitarianism and emergency in terms of how, and we sort of traditionally tend to think about it in two ways. Responses to natural disasters, perhaps responses to epidemics, so like Ebola would be a big one, or responses to refugee populations. And those refugee populations can be caused by multiple things. They can be caused by war, they can be caused by famine, they can be caused by complex emergencies, etc., etc. But we tend to often think about humanitarians responding to the needs of displaced people on the move, people who've had to cross borders or people who are displaced within their own states, who can, because they are not at home, because they are dislocated from their support networks, their economic networks, their jobs, their livelihoods, their families, their communities, are in need of what we call, in the biopolitical definition, the necessary conditions for life. And these are food, water, sanitation, and kind of basic medical care. The things that we all need to survive. And if we don't have them, we very, very quickly realize that our lives are actually all very precarious. I mean, we're all like about 2 days away from probably dying, especially in this heat, if we don't have enough water. And we kind of take this completely for granted, but it's really hot today, and if you didn't drink this, any of this today, you're going to feel really, really ill by like midnight tonight. So we're all actually kind of teetering on the edge, and it's amazing actually that such our societies function usually so well, actually. And as I said, humanitarianism is seen as different from human rights, and it's different also from developmental work. There has been an attempt, because this recognition that humanitarianism actually responds to political failures and often tends to only what we call kind of patch the wound, add a sticking plaster, right? Put a Band-Aid on it. You're probably all too young to remember Band-Aid. As well, it was a good name. It's often seen as only sort of responding to a crisis and returning things to a status quo, leaving the structural conditions, the structural causes that underpin many of these crises kind of intact, right? So if it's a response to a famine, it's a response to a food emergency, humanitarians go in, offer food, offer therapeutic feeding, offer, various ways to sort of stem off or treat malnutrition, and then they leave. They don't actually focus on the causes of food insecurity. They don't focus on increasingly climate change. They don't focus on inadequate farming methods or sort of global trends or global sort of agribusiness or agricultural trade, which sees it's actually much more profitable for farmers predominantly in the global south to sell their goods to the global north and not to their local populations. So they don't address issues, for example, of food insecurity, because that's developmental work. There's been a shift, there's been a change, there's been a kind of recognition in some humanitarian quarters that you have to focus on developmental work. Oxfam is the sort of the prime example of this, right? Oxfam, originally set up by a bunch of bored middle-class Oxford housewives responding to famine in West Bengal in like 100 years ago now or so, then actually has become much more focused on developmental work, right? Focusing on the sort of the causes of insecurity. Oxfam is the perfect example of this. But increasingly we are seeing it in responses to migration, in responses to refugees, as there is an increasing discussion, especially in Northern Europe, around addressing the problems of refugees at source. Why do refugees move? Right? They move to find life. So why can't we provide life for them in their countries and places of origin? And so you're seeing increasingly sort of suggestions that in Jordan, for example, there will be built a huge export processing zone, sort of a huge factory zone in which refugees can work for money, for some kind of a livelihood, producing various goods. And it's this idea that this could be rolled out universally, and that refugees could sort of stay where they are, but be given some kind of a livelihood. It's a very neoliberal response to the problems, and really sort of reduces the complexity, actually, of why people move, and actually fails to address perhaps the politics of what it is that causes conflicts. It certainly isn't going to solve the Syrian civil war, just having refugees stay in the region and work in factories producing cheap goods for export to Europe and elsewhere. But we sort of start to see this developmental logic coming in also to attempts to sort of deal with and manage displaced populations. But this is a genealogy of humanitarianism in the Mediterranean, in Europe, within the kind of current crisis, right? Within the kind of notion of saving, rescuing people at sea, providing relief, providing care, providing the necessary conditions for life for migrants. And it shouldn't come as a shock, because I've already said this, but rescues and caregiving, you go down, I had a little walk around the fish market yesterday, but you go down to the port, find some fishermen, and you speak to enough of them, I'm sure some of them will have stories to tell you about the times that someone they know, or their father, or their grandfather, or they rescued people at sea. Right? It's pretty normal practice for fishermen. Or talk to some of the people working on the bigger vessels. Right? They'll probably be able to tell you about the time that they were asked to respond, or that they came across another vessel in distress and rescued them. Right? This is not new. The controversies surrounding it are not new. Right? There are histories, there are stories of fishermen, for example, from Pozzallo, who rescued people in the 1990s, were then accused of people smuggling, had their boats taken away from them. They finally fought their case after 5 years. They won, but by this point, they hadn't been allowed to fish because they'd had their boat confiscated, and they'd lost their business. All from the act of doing their duty to rescue lives at sea. The international maritime law says that when a vessel is in distress, the nearest vessel has a responsibility to pick it up and to collect it and to rescue the people. Right? That is the kind of international law of the sea. Because the sea, no one is sovereign in the sea, so you have to take responsibility for others. Because you hope that they will also take responsibility for you. It's a reciprocal arrangement. Right? You go out there in your fishing boat, you're going to hope that if you get into distress, the nearest other boat is going to come and help you. Because that's just kind of the decent human thing to do. These things, as I say, are not new. They're not new within the context of the Mediterranean. How many of you have heard of the case of the Cap Anamur? Yes, no. It was in the reading. Right, the Cap Anamur was in the early 2000s, was a German NGO vessel, kind of built on the ideas and similar beliefs to earlier attempts to rescue the Vietnam boat people who fled Vietnam in the 1970s. It was sort of this German vessel was present in the southern Mediterranean, in the central Mediterranean here, rescued people, didn't immediately report that it rescued people, carried on looking for a few more boats, people in distress, eventually made land, and the captain of the boat, the crew of the boat, were accused of people smuggling. But this is not new. And it's not limited to this crisis, right? It's not limited to the Mediterranean. right? We see this is going on continuously in the sea between Indonesia and northern Australia. We see it also in the sea between Myanmar and other parts of Southeast Asia. There's also been historical cases of it, for example, between Cuba and Florida. But within the Italian context, it's very interesting, and Italy has a very kind of central role historically within the European context. So the 1990s really became, we think about it in terms of post-Arab Spring, right, post-2011. But actually the 1990s, we saw many, many rescues in the Adriatic, especially with people, Albanians, trying to sort of get out of the collapsing Albania and the huge financial crisis, the huge economic crisis that was going on in the Adriatic. And this is really where a kind of very clearly stated humanitarian response to these boat people, the people in boats that need to be rescued, and then their needs also continuing on land, kind of emerged, was taken up politically by both local actors and at a kind of more national level, and the tension that it produced with border control, with attempts to actually stop people moving and coming into Italy from Albania irregularly. And it's really where we sort of, for the first time, got a real understanding also about the role of organized criminal networks, scafisti, in these particular processes. So there's a wonderful book, I encourage you all to read it, by someone called Maurizio Albahari. He's an Italian anthropologist. He's based in the US now, but he has basically spent years studying this. The book is called Crimes of Peace. And he spent years studying this, and he has such a wonderful ethnographic sort of history of these attempts from the 1990s, from the kind of Albanian crisis, right, up until the present day. So he's done a lot of work, both on the Adriatic coast and also here in Sicily, and also in Lampedusa. So if you want to sort of really get a sort of sense of how this has played out and how it's played out politically between sort of local mayors who want to sort of kind of, feel good about themselves and offer hospitality to these rescued Albanians, other local politicians like, no, we can't allow them in, they're irregular, the Catholic Church taking it upon themselves to welcome, to provide shelter and more longer term facilities for people who are rescued. And then various politicians at the national level taking it up and using it as a campaigning strategy, be it to actually have a more humane approach to the problem of irregular migrants coming from by sea, or vice versa, to have a stricter, harsher policy. And then within that you have the security professionals and practitioners that are themselves sort of implicated in this as the ones that are tasked with both rescuing and also policing the border. And there have been some horrible, tragic accidents where people being rescued have actually lost their lives because the Coast Guard and the Italian military got confused, or other people said actually they weren't confused, they were acting in an aggressive manner towards these particular boats because they were concerned with stopping the smugglers and not concerned with the human lives of just the regular people that were on board these vessels. So I encourage you all very much to read this book. It's really, really wonderful. It's a beautiful read. It's beautiful anthropology where you can just kind of read it. It's like, it's very, it's a horrible, not a very pleasant content or subject matter, but it is beautifully written. But importantly, also within the context of sort of humanitarian intervention, when we think about humanitarianism within the context of the Mediterranean, the setting matters, right? The setting is really, really important. And very famously, one of the founding members of Médecins Sans Frontières, Ronnie Brauman, says that there is no such thing as kind of humanitarian practice, right? Humanitarian practice can't be defined. It can only be understood within the particular settings that it takes place. So in this context, the sea, the Mediterranean, is really, really important for the type of humanitarianism, the type of interventions that we see. So within the context of the Mediterranean, within the context of the Strait of Sicily, rescue, the very, very visceral act of rescuing life, taking people from the sea, people who are drowning or are at serious risk of drowning, and putting them on your vessel and taking them to dry land, this becomes an act of humanitarianism. It's very different from other forms of humanitarianism, which can be much more complicated, right? The prevention of Ebola, which requires complex treatment centers, complex technologies around stopping the spread of the disease, etc., etc. It's not giving therapeutic foods to starving infants, making sure they have just the right amount of calories that they can absorb without taking on too much and making them sicker. And it's not a very, it's technical, but it's not deeply scientific, right? It's not also, and this is where it's very interesting to think about the role of MSF in this, it's not medical humanitarianism. Yes, certain medical actions are carried out on these search and rescue vessels, but really it's about the very visceral act of saving lives. And interestingly, it does actually cause some tensions within particular organizations who kind of ask about, well, what actually is the humanitarian need for rescue? It's not really humanitarian, it's a sovereign responsibility. The rescuing of lives at sea is actually the responsibility, or they will argue, is the responsibility of states. Italy, Malta, Libya, Tunisia, other European member states. And if they will not, they say if they will not respond, or they will not carry out their responsibilities, or that the situation is too great, that they can't, right? Because there's always a limit to what people can do, right? Boats can't be everywhere all of the time, right? Then you need more and more boats, and you need to have this kind of snowballing of humanitarian rescue. A very clear example of how boats can't be everywhere all at once, and it's very difficult for us to see what is going on in the straits because it's far out at sea. But the crossing from Turkey to Greece is very, very small. You can see Turkey across the strait. In fact, that's Turkey across the strait there. When they introduced the NATO mission in the Aegean to stop the boats, I just fell about laughing because I just was like, there were two big Navy destroyers which take so long to turn around, and they can't go backwards, and they can all they can do is do this, and then there's these little boats, and they come so fast, and they're not actually going that fast, but there's hundreds of them at a time. You watch, it's like Pac-Man. Oh no, not Pac-Man. That old school game where you had the little things coming down, you had to kind of... There is no way that these two big boats could catch all of these little boats. It'd be like... Right? So, this idea that boats can be everywhere all of the time is also false, right? We have to think about the realities of what it is to be at sea. Right? Many of these small boats now don't have radios or satellite phones or ways of contacting and asking for rescue. So how do these boats find them? They either have to do it using kind of radar, or they have to do it by sight, or they have to go to the places in which they know these boats are going to be. Right? So that is also why we've seen rescues happening more and more and closer at a very specific point on the Libyan coast where they know the boats set out from. And then it's very much a case of doing it by sight. Some organizations use drones, others use, or then they have the sort of flyovers by the Italian military who are able to locate vessels. But it is really just a case of kind of being effectively in the right place at the right time. But of course, this genealogy of humanitarianism is fundamentally linked to the increasingly exclusive, and we could say violent nature of Europe's borders. For a kind of very good overview of the ways in which the world's borders have become more and more dangerous for more and more people, I would encourage you to read the new book by a good friend of mine, Rhys Jones. It's called Violent Borders. He's a political geographer, but he's written a book, it's published by Verso, so he's written a book that's designed for a more kind of wider, less academically focused audience, and he really tracks the ways in which, increasingly for a vast majority of the world's populations, the ability to exercise your rights to mobility, the ability to cross a border from one state, your own state to another, or another state to another state, has become increasingly precarious. Right? Within the context of the European Union, we can see that with the birth of Schengen, with the attempts to allow freedom of movement within, this went along with an attempt to strengthen the external borders. And this was done predominantly through the introduction of two things. Much more restrictive, harsher visa regimes, where you needed a visa before a Schengen visa from a Schengen country before you were able to travel. And the getting of that visa is very, very difficult for many, many people. It requires having a lot of money. I mean, I know many people who are European Union citizens who, if they actually lived somewhere else, wouldn't get a Schengen visa because they don't have 10,000 euros in a bank account. Right? And they just don't have the financial resources or capabilities to do it. This went alongside what we call carrier's liability, or sometimes called strict carrier's liability, because it is very strict. And what this did was it placed the responsibility of managing whether or not people had the correct documentation, so had these visas, onto the transport companies, onto the airlines, onto the ferry companies, onto the bus companies, onto the rail companies. Right? And it's the airlines which check now increasingly, right, whether or not you have a visa. And if you don't have the visa, you can't get on the aeroplane. I have many, many friends from back when I was a PhD student in London who are Iranian. They came their families came to the United Kingdom in 1979, 1980, following the Iranian Revolution. Right? Their parents were at risk. Right? What did their parents do? They went to the airport in Tehran or Shiraz or wherever, and they got a plane. They were like, oh, we know people in London, or we speak English. We'll go to London. What did they do? They got on the plane, they sat down, British Airways, arrived at Heathrow, got off the plane and said, hello, I'm Iranian, I would like to apply and claim asylum. And, oh yes, okay, thank you, yes. Asylum granted. They couldn't do that now because they wouldn't have a visa. They would get to the airport, British Airways staff would say, I'm sorry, there is no visa in your passport, so you can't get on the airplane. Right? Do anybody remember, which one was it? Not MH17, which was the other one? 370? There's too many Malaysian airlines. The one that disappeared somewhere in the South Australian Sea, they think, right? There were two guys on that plane that they think were, I think they were Iranian, with, they say, false passports, right? They say they had Danish passports. Why did they have those passports? Why did they probably pay an awful lot of money for those passports? Because it meant that they could travel to Europe without a visa. They thought they were going to be safe. They thought, we can get to Europe this way. This is a safe way. And they partly went to Malaysia because actually it's a huge well, it's easier for them to get to Malaysia and then from Malaysia, and also there's a huge business in false or stolen documentation there. They probably thought, we're going to be safe. We don't have to travel all the way over land, try and get in a dinghy, pay lots of money. Actually, it's probably cheaper still even to buy a false passport and then an airline ticket. Right? We're going to be safe. We're going to arrive. They're originally supposed to arrive in Schiphol. They're going to arrive in Schiphol. They're going to walk up to the guards at the marechaussee, at the booth, and say, hello, I am Iranian. I am in risk. The idea that they think that they were homosexual. I'm at risk of persecution in Iran. I would like to claim asylum. And they would be like, okay, come with me. And they would be taken off, debriefed, and they would go through the asylum process. These restrictions are the reason why people have to travel in these highly precarious ways. They have no other choice. It's either that or they don't come. Right? But for many people, life is not worth living in their countries of origin or their countries of transit. Right? They want to seek life. They want to have a future for themselves, for their children. And therefore, these very unsafe forms of transportation are the only things available to them, because Europe has closed off the right to safe travel to these people. And so this is what William Walters has called the humanitarian border. Right? This is the idea that for more and more people, right, the risks of crossing borders has grown exponentially. And because those risks to life, have grown exponentially, the need for, the requirement, the emergency to save lives has also grown. But there is an intimate, important relationship here between the ways in which we choose to manage our borders and the need to save lives. And I will end it there, and we will reconvene. Okay, thank you.